I'm Amy Morgan, the feature writer for the Marriage Initiative. I am so delighted today to introduce Joe and Al Janssen. Al is a teacher, writer, and editor with more than 40 years of experience, including working as director of book publishing for Focus on the Family for 10 years. He and Joe traveled extensively across the Muslim world with brother Andrew for 35 years, encouraging couples in the persecuted church with Christian marriage resources based on Al's book, Your Marriage Masterpiece, which was named Focus on the Family's Marriage Book of the Year in 2001. I've got a copy right here. The couple raised 3 children while Al was on staff with Campus Crusade for Christ and Pro Athletes Outreach, where he helped more than 100 professional athletes document their Christian testimonies. Al began a literary services company in 1982, has authored or co-authored more than 32 books, and edited many more through Harvest House Publishers and Multnomah Press. In 2010, Al was ordained as a priest in the Anglican Church, and Joe is also an author in her own right. Al, Joe, thank you so much for being here.
Thank you, Amy. It's great to be here.
Oh, I just can't wait to get started. Tell us about your journey. You started in sports writing?
Yeah, well, my dream was to play center field for the New York Yankees. The only thing I lacked was athletic ability. So minor detail. So in high school, I started writing for the local town newspaper covering the sports from Sherwood High School, and continued that in college. And then after college, went with Campus Crusade for Christ, and they knew about my sports writing background, and I became editor of Athletes in Action magazine. So yeah, my writing started because of my love of sports, my way to hang around athletes and enjoyed that element. And by the way, it's a great way to learn your craft of writing. So I'm really glad to have had that opportunity.
You tell a story in your book and your marriage masterpiece, but you tell a story about how you were, I think you were in Wisconsin, weren't you? Somewhere really cold, and you were covering a very big, was it the football game? And you realized that there was no wife there to share it with.
Yeah, that was it was in Green Bay, as a matter of fact. Green Bay, Wisconsin. At that time, it was the second coldest game ever played there, and I was doing a profile on one of the Green Bay Packer players. So I had an all-field pass. I had on 5 pairs of socks on, and my feet were still freezing. It was the week of Thanksgiving, and it was also the week of my birthday. And I hadn't anybody to talk to about it, nobody to call home about. It was just one of those, what an interesting experience. So I think at that time I remember praying, God, I would like to have at least a friend. I wouldn't mind a beautiful friend. And we met the following April, I believe it was. Yeah.
April of 1977.
That's right. So
April 17th, actually. About 10:30 in the morning, trying to get exact.
And you were singing in the choir at church, right?
I was.
Yeah, and I saw her, the angel in the choir.
The alto section.
I love that, because there you were, kind of, I would think that for a young man who loved sports and who wanted to be a sports writer, being at the Green Bay Packers, that would be kind of a pinnacle moment, and that yet you still realize the truth that it is not good for man to be alone.
Right. Yeah. Well, sports actually is not the best for married and family life either. Our first 3 or 4 years, I was working with a ministry called Pro Athletes Outreach. So every Sunday, I was watching every single NFL game because I knew people on every team. Well, that wasn't the best for married life. But I mean, she was great about it. She knew that was what I was doing. But honestly, over time, I got bored with sports, and I realized there were other things that I was interested in and learning and doing and writing about. And so over time, gradually sports kind of faded. I think we'll watch the Super Bowl this year, but if so, it'll be only the second full football game I've watched this year. So as you can see, I've matured a little bit since those early days.
Reprioritized.
Yeah, reprioritized. That's a good way to put it.
That's a good one. So let's talk about your next step then. You went from pro athletes outreach, although I think that is really interesting, about 100 Christian testimonies from the athletes. That's just really...
Well, athletes are always asked to sign an autograph, and there's get a piece of paper or a jersey or sign my arm or what, crazy things. And I suggested to the athletes, why don't you tell me what you would like to say if you had 5 minutes with each person you signed an autograph for? And then I would get a picture from their team, and we print them up 1,000 or 2,000 or 3,000 at a time. And they were a great resource. So yeah, I think we did about 110 of those. NFL and Major League Baseball, professional soccer,
hockey.
Yeah, hockey and basketball. Yeah. We did all of them.
Do you have those compiled in a body of work, or were they just one-offs where they'd be able to hand them?
I've got a stack of one of each of them.
I might have to ask you about a couple of my favorite players and see if we could get a copy at some point, because that would be really meaningful. Because you're right, a testimony, to be able to use a platform. We all saw, how when the Eagles or the Buffalo Bills player was injured, how that became such a platform for everyone to just immediately pray.
Right.
And to want to reach out and to seek the Lord. So it is amazing when God gives people talents and abilities, how he uses those in different ways.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, it was really, we don't know how many seeds were sown with that, but I think that it was a great tool. I don't know if athletes still do that today. I hope those, they still do.
Maybe you've sparked something.
We'll see.
Yeah. Well, then let's talk about some of your other publishing experiences.
I started a business after I left Pro Athletes Outreach, and for several years helped various writers write their stories, write their books, edited many more. Did one of the first books with Gary Smalley, who's a marriage, was starting his marriage ministry at the time. In fact, the book I did with him, Joy That Lasts, he considered the most important of his books because it incorporated his spiritual journey with his marriage story as well. Did some books with Bill Bright, Steve Douglas, who was president, followed Bill Bright at Campus Crusade. Did my sports biography with dear Christian brother who played for several years for the Cleveland Indians, Andre Thornton, after his wife and daughter were killed in a car accident. So he asked me to help him tell that story. So that was really a privilege, Amy, because my purpose was to be as a servant to help others who had a story or had a message to tell, but didn't have either the time or skill necessarily to put it in writing, and to be able to talk to me and let me put it in their, hopefully what sounded like their words, was a real privilege. And so, yeah, and then I also did a book with, there was a man in ministry, Bob George, and I was helping him with a book, and he kept telling me about his wife's story, how her husband she grew up in Ukraine, and her husband was taken to the Gulag, and then her mom and sister were taken as captives by Nazi Germany. So here's a 6-year-old girl riding in those trains, and so telling that story through her point of view, and then the miraculous way she got to meet her dad 40 years later, and lead him to Christ. So those are great privileges to be able to.
What was the name of that book?
The name is Goodbye Is Not Forever by Amy George.
Oh, I need to read that one. That sounds like it's just right up my alley. Oh gosh.
Very good. Al is, God gave him the gift of being able to write in somebody else's voice, and when you read the books he's written for other people, you could just hear them talking with their idioms, their voice. He really is able to convey that very well.
And then you went to Focus.
Actually, we had a third baby on the way and no insurance to pay for it. So I was hired by Multnomah Press and worked with them for 4 years. And then was hired by Focus to run their book publishing division.
Yes. And somewhere along there, as you were working and exposed to so many wonderful, you mentioned it being like a banquet of Christian resources, family, marriage, parenting, all sorts of things. You kind of had a revelation.
Well, yeah, it's true. I was, I published Neil Clark Warren, Gary Smalley, John Trent, Gary Rosberg, bunch of other names you'd probably recognize. But also, as I was doing that, it didn't seem like all of these great resources were having much impact on the longevity of Christian marriages. In fact, at that time, the divorce rate among Christians seemed to be about the same as the population as a whole. And then there was a very well-known Christian leader that I knew who was involved in family ministry, and he ended up having an affair, leaving his wife, and getting a divorce. And I thought, here's a man that probably knew all of the people we've talked about, all of these principles, but it didn't change his heart. So my thought was, maybe we need to do something that teaches and helps people understand the reason for marriage, the meaning of marriage. Maybe that would provide more motivation than to use all these other great resources that are there. So with my friend Kurt Bruner, who at the time was executive vice president for creative part of Focus on the Family, he's also ordained minister, and he and I worked together on the whiteboard and brainstormed what became Your Marriage Masterpiece, which is the idea is that marriage, the first marriage existed before the fall. The last marriage will be after creation is restored to its original beauty at the end of Revelation, the great wedding feast of the Lamb. So marriage is obviously critical, integral to God's plan for humanity. But something went very wrong with the first marriage. And when I realized the first marriage was originally actually a three-way relationship, a man and a wife with God in the middle of it. But basically, I don't know if this would be a proper way of saying it, but they divorced God. They removed God from the picture. And ever since, we've had the problems in the family. And so I started thinking, well, what is the picture that God intended marriage to be? And we certainly see celebrity marriages today, all kinds of relationships in the media. But most people have not, or many Christians even, have not seen a good, healthy marriage, maybe in their home or an extended family. The picture of marriage that is most powerful, we discovered, was God's marriage. First, he says he was a husband to Israel.
Yeah.
And then, of course, Jesus is the bridegroom, with the church as the bride. So the idea of this was to try and tell the story of God's marriage and what can we learn from it that would help us with our marriages.
I thought it was so interesting and very compelling. And before we unpack it a little bit more, I do want to give a nod to Joe, because about this time, while she was running the house and raising the three children, you also were writing your own book, correct, Joe?
Yes, I was. I was asked by, was it Tyndale?
There we go.
And that is something that really is, it speaks to my heart, because that is one of the gifts that I feel like perhaps God has given me a little bit, because I do enjoy hosting. So that's one I want to dig into as well. That looks really interesting. So I wanted to make sure that you were highlighted as well, because although you were the wonderful support system and helpmate, you were also a published author too.
But let me just say that part of the ministry that a couple should have is that of hospitality, having people in your home. One of the most effective witnesses for a healthy Christian marriage is to be able for people to come in and see your marriage. I mean, it's one thing if we got on a platform and we could show off for an hour and present a nice picture. But when you're at home and maybe there's some kids running around a little crazy, or
things go wrong.
Yeah. That's where you begin to see what the marriage really is.
Yeah, well, and that's a very, very valuable contribution. So I wanted to make sure to highlight that. So Al, let's get a little bit more into the marriage masterpiece. I was really struck by your idea about God marrying, the Israelites and then later with Jesus, of course, the church. And sometimes you really break down the theology in a way that's very approachable. You use some suppositions with angelic visitors kind of peering over to see what God was doing. Sometimes you used a modern day translation, like you did with the story of Hosea. And I really thought that it's very readable, even though there's some really good theology in it.
Well, that was the idea, was to try and make it a accessible, popular theology, a theology of marriage. And the gist of it is, as you alluded to tell God's story. And when we examined the whole of Scripture, and you look at the Bible as one great, grand story, a meta-narrative, it comes through that God's marriage with the Israelites and later with the church is not an easy one. I wanted to start where we start, which is, well, he loves us, and so it's a romantic marriage. It is, but that's not where God started. God started with a covenant, and so I go back to the Genesis chapter 15, where God and Abraham enter into a covenant relationship, and I believe that was the original marriage ceremony, because the covenant ceremony that was used in that was used for hundreds, more than 1,000 years between tribes or between families, to betroth a young boy and a young girl, to say, you two are going to get married someday. It had nothing to do whether they wanted to marry each other, where they liked each other, but that's where it started. Yes, passion, romance does come into it, and that's the Song of Solomon. And so we realized that there was a love story behind the Song of Solomon, and theologians throughout the centuries have interpreted it as a picture of God's love for Israel and Christ's love for the church. So those were the first two. Later, in this latest edition that you're showing of this book, I added the next element, which is the communication. And the amazing thing about the marriage is that there is an ability, an invitation for the bride to express herself. Israel, and you look at it in the Psalms, many of the Psalms get pretty raw. Our prayers can be pretty tame today compared to the prayers that people prayed. So we did a section on communication. Then after that came the fighting marriage, where God fights with his bride to save the covenant. And Ezekiel 16 is a beautiful picture of that, where God recounts the love story with Jerusalem and how she became his bride, and then she um, slept around and committed adultery, and God gets pretty angry with her.
Yeah.
And yet at the very end, still, come back to me. Let's be committed to one another. So there's always that sense. Yeah, there were emotional moments where God would say, I want to divorce you, or I'm divorcing you, and yet 2 verses later, come back to me. So there's a honest emotional element to that. So I call that the fighting marriage. You mentioned the Hosea story, which I consider a one-sided marriage. There's really no evidence that Hosea got anything out of his marriage with Gomer, but he was obedient to God, and he was faithful to her, and he loved her and cared for her. And to me, that's one of the things that has really impressed me with some Christian marriages, where maybe one person is has Alzheimer's or has an injury, or for some reason emotionally is not able to give the way the spouse would want to. But do you break the marriage up for that? Do you say, well, I'm not getting enough out of this, so what about me? Which is a very American reaction. And yet some of the most beautiful marriages Joe and I have seen have been what we would consider a one-sided marriage. And then the final element is what I call the heroic marriage, because Jesus, in order to have his bride, the church, had to fulfill the covenant commitment that was made back in Genesis 15, when Abraham was not allowed to walk that blood path of the covenant. God walked it alone, which meant that if either party violated the covenant, and God was not going to, but when Israelites violated it, God would pay the blood price. And that's what the cross is about. Jesus paid the blood price to have his bride, the church. So we call that the heroic marriage. That's a summary of the theology that I believe is a beautiful picture that could be very, very practically applied to our lives today.
Well, and like you said, it kind of gives the why. Why have a one-sided marriage? Because, in America today, as you mentioned, even at the beginning of the book, if you're not happy, isn't the goal happiness? If you're not happy, why stay married? But yet happiness can fluctuate and does fluctuate over a lifetime, over a marriage. And if
one of the research things that I discovered as I was writing this book was there was research done of couples who were in an unhappy marriage, and they went back 5 years later. Those that had not divorced, most of them actually found that their marriage was actually happy. So if they'd stuck it out, if they worked it, they might have wound up with a happy marriage. The problem is they didn't let the story play out. They didn't let God write the rest of the story.
I love how you use the analogy of the masterpiece, and you say, let God finish the masterpiece. Mm-hmm. Let him be the author of it. And it's really inspirational, especially the stories of scripture and how you could internalize them. But you, 20 years ago when you wrote this, did not want to go on the book tour and do the usual things that most people do when they write a marriage resource. You chose a different path. So let's talk about that, because that's something that you and Joe, that was a journey you guys took together eventually. So let's talk about that.
Well, you're right. Many of the people that I'd worked with who, they had seminars around the country, radio programs, various things that would promote their books. But at the time this book was published, God was already moving us into a new direction. We'd been exposed to the ministry of the persecuted church. Actually, I had my first exposure to it back in 1989 in the Soviet Union. Another story for another time. But through that, got to meet Brother Andrew in 1994. Joe and I went on our first trip and spent a week with him in the Netherlands where he lived, where I had a chance to interview him about his work in the Muslim world. He was, of course, best known for being God's smuggler and taking Bibles. Yeah, there you go, God's smuggler. But when that book was published, he couldn't go back to Eastern Europe. So he started working in the Middle East and the Muslim world. And I took a trip with him in June of 2001 to Israel, West Bank, and Gaza. Some amazing experiences. And we kind of clicked on that. And he started thinking, well, does God give me something to say? Well, 3 months later, the events of 9/11 occurred. And Andrew says, I think God has given me something to say. And would you be willing to come work with me? And God had been moving us and preparing us because here we have all these amazing resources available to us, thousands of great Christian books, few of them right behind me.
Your favorites.
My favorites, right? But there are places in the world where Christians would give anything to have one of those books. And that's where we wanted to minister. And so God, I believe, had been preparing us for a couple of years. But when the invitation came, we knew it was time to go and minister where the church is struggling for its very survival.
And you took your marriage masterpiece and you could do some marriage ministry to pastors and wives, new Christians. And they were so grateful. Talk about that. Tell us about that's so exciting to think that you went in places that you can't even tell us. You can tell us a couple of them.
No, I can tell you our first seminar was a little one for our Open Doors staff and their wives in Turkey. So
I forgot about that.
Yeah, that was the first time we did it.
Yeah.
And then we were invited. I was speaking at some pastors' conferences. This was why I got this collar, was because they wanted me to be ordained. And Joe started coming with me. We developed a way to particularly minister and tell this in a Muslim context. What we discovered was telling God's story and a story of God's marriage actually was a very effective way to communicate the picture of Christian marriage to Muslim couples, and many of whom their marriages are arranged, and it's very different from what we're used to. So yes, I had an opportunity to teach. Joe often would meet separately with the wives, and it was a lot of fun to do together.
It was interesting presenting the Christian view of marriage versus the Muslim view of marriage. It was a real, because they're steeped in the Muslim culture, and they were just following the Muslim culture and the way that their marriages worked. And so to teach them the Christian way of a marriage working was delightful.
We even found that many Christian marriages were more Muslim in their behavior than Christian. So because they'd never seen the
they didn't know any of it. They didn't know any different.
Yeah. So the way they treated their wives, or the questions I was asked on more than one occasion, my wife is not getting pregnant. Can I take another wife? Or, don't get asked that in America. That might change, but
yeah, no, but that was, you told me a story about, and he was a kind of a prominent chieftain, and everyone was really pushing him to either divorce his wife or take another one. And then you guys kind of stepped in, right?
Well, not us personally, but yes, it's a wonderful story. I was there when this man's wife was baptized, and she was just really struggling because she was unable to get pregnant. And in that culture, a
wife's job is to produce sons.
Yes. And so I don't know how many years, probably she'd been married 8 or 10 years. Her husband had come to Christ, and not unusual in that culture. Okay, the husband comes to Christ. He turns and tells his wife, by the way, now you're a Christian. And that doesn't always work very well either. But so she was really struggling with that. And there was a lot of pressure on this man to take another wife, or to even divorce his wife and take another wife, so that he could produce an heir who would eventually grow up to be the head of that tribe. His wife, after 15 years of marriage, got very ill with some blood disease, and she needed a transfusion. And our ministry helped them with that, got her the medical attention she needs. She finally went back to her tribe with the medications and so on. And lo and behold, miraculously, she got pregnant. And by the way, again, in Islamic context, a sick wife like that would be another reason to divorce her. She's damaged goods. But he wouldn't do that. And my point in telling that story is to say, look, this is what God wants to do. He wants to write a story in which he is glorified. And they had a beautiful, healthy baby boy. He's probably around 15 years old now. What an incredible story, visual testimony to that tribe, to that culture around them, of what God can do. Just like what God did with Abraham and Sarah, or,
a story they might have been familiar with, even from the Islamic tradition.
Correct.
That. And you had also told me about a wedding, a really special Christian wedding that you all were part of.
Yes, I ought to show you a picture of my.
Where's that picture?
Yeah, my wife dressed in a traditional dress there.
The traditional wedding garb for the women in that society is a red sari with gold threads and gold designs on it.
So
they got me. They dressed me up. They wrapped me up in a wedding sari.
About 5 yards of.
Where are you? I love it, though. I bet you looked beautiful.
Oh,
thank you.
Oh, she was gorgeous. But yes, we had done this weekend seminar for 100 couples, and they were all converts from Islam. And they wanted at the end to have a ceremony in which they could exchange their wedding vows. And so I worked with a bishop in England who helped me design a ceremony in which they all dressed up, and many of them were in such poverty that we actually provided them with the outfits as well, both the men and the women. And they turned to one another, and they exchanged vows, and they exchanged Bibles in their language. And then I celebrated communion. For probably half of them had never had communion before. Explained the significance of communion in the marriage context, that this is our one way of fellowshipping with our bridegroom. So there were some local pastors that helped distribute the communion while I prayed a blessing over each couple, and then they had their picture taken, and they were able to have a memento that they could look at together. So this is our covenant commitment that we made together. So it was really, and the funny thing was, it was our 39th wedding anniversary.
Yeah, then when it was all over, they celebrated our anniversary.
They celebrated. It happened to be our anniversary that day.
That's right, it was our anniversary. Yes.
That is so special, and what a testimony, like you said, in living your life and in front of people and with people in hospitality and in your example. And you were saying too, I mean, in the Muslim world, that many who met you might have been the only Christians, the only Christian marriage that they had ever seen, that they would ever know.
I believe this approach could be very effective for evangelism, because now those 100 couples are now lights in their community. And believe me, particularly the women will say, there's something different about something better. How do we get that?
Yeah.
And so I think it could be a very effective, powerful way of evangelism through Christian marriages.
Well,
And
and your legacy,
going with that, yeah.
yeah, and your legacy lives on, because even though you're not traveling to the Middle East anymore, your legacy lives on for the people, with the people and the organizations that you started. So, oh, it's so interesting. I just love hearing about it, and I know everyone has too. But oh my goodness, we are out of time. It was just so fun talking to you. I could just keep talking forever, but we've run over. So anyway,
you didn't get to hear much from my wife here. My beautiful wife.
Well, Joe, do you have something particular you'd like to share with us real quick?
No, I really don't. I think everything's been said. Thank you very much.
Oh, well, I know you were part of all of that, and you and your red sari will be a beautiful visual for us all to think of you and in the way you participated. But thank you so much for sharing your time with us.
Well, thank you, Amy. This was a privilege to share this, and I hope it will be an encouragement to people.
Oh, I know it will. And Marriage Champions, as always, if you'd like to connect with the Janssens, you can find out more at marriageinitiative.org.